Welcome to Dr Joe Unplugged. This podcast contains general information and is not in any way medical advice. Data can be very dry, but a number I heard recently really stuck in my mind, and that number is 40. All right, what's the significance of 40? I've listened at times to the RFKJ podcast, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the independent candidate for presidency in the United States, and on a previous episode we've spoken about the question that nobody wants to ask about processed foods that RFKJ has posed. On his podcast, he interviewed Renee Zagarius. I'm not sure I've got the pronunciation completely correct. He's Dutch, so apologies in advance if I've muffled that. And they were talking about drug problems in America. And in the United States, there's in excess of 100,000 overdose deaths annually. And that number is not going down. I think in 2022, I think that's the most recent figures, was about 110,000. That's a staggering number. And yes, they've tried to, in some way, shape or form, get on top of the opioid issue with the prescription medications and what are called the pill mills. It's been replaced by fentanyl issues, which, as I'm given to understand, is just literally flooding in across the southern border. It's a real problem for them. In Australia, we have close to 2,000 overdose deaths per year, and obviously on a per capita basis, that is quite a lot less, but that number also hasn't been in a downwards trend. In the Netherlands, according to Renee, in a discussion with RFK Jr., last year they had 40 overdose deaths. Now, to put that in perspective, if you, on a per capita basis, applied that to the United States, it would be about 750 instead of 110,000. If you applied it to Australia, it would be about 60 instead of nearly 2,000. So the immediate question should arise in the minds of people, and I'm sure other countries have problems as well, especially in the Anglosphere. And Renee did make the point that Europe in general has less issues in the Anglosphere, and by that I mean United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, UK. There should be interest into why is this the case. And he did make the point that if you go back to the 70s and 80s, the Amsterdam in particular had similar problems to San Francisco, which is, I've not been there for 20 odd years, but I gather is the sort of poster boy for problems with drugs and the knock-on effects, including homelessness and crime and. So there should be interest. There doesn't appear to be a lot. So the obvious question is, what are the Netherlands doing right? And Renee said that if in the 80s and 70s, and I had the good fortune to visit there last year and was told on a street tour, so on the street that we're on now, if we were here in the 1970s, you would see needles on the street, you would see people on the street, there'd be defecation on the street, and the Dutch authorities decided they needed to do something about it. And part of that was a liberal approach to cannabis. He said if they want to get people off heroin, then they did need to have some option or alternative other than jail, and that was, I suppose, effectively legalising or at least decriminalising cannabis, because you can't lethally overdose on cannabis. Now, again, we're talking not here in a medical sense, and I do need to point out that I'm medical advisor to Little Green Pharma, which is a medicinal cannabis company, but what we're talking about here in the Netherlands is not for medicinal purposes. What he also said was that they had a multi-pronged approach. They said it wasn't just as simple as safe injecting rooms, and that's been an issue in Australia. That wasn't the only solution, because, yes, that meant that they might not contract bloodborne viruses, but it didn't really address the bigger problem. He also said just putting homeless people in a home didn't work because some people weren't going to come at that. They literally cannot live in a home. It can be difficult for people to wrap their heads around that, but it is the case. And also that crime was not necessarily going to be tolerated. So there would be a case for putting some people in jail. But he said by combining or collaborating perhaps the roles of health practitioners, and that includes probably doctors, addiction specialists, psychiatrists, with local government, with the housing department, and I suspect in the Netherlands that's a federal concern, social workers and also police, that there was not a one-size-fits-all. It wasn't either let's lock them all up or let's just let them do whatever they want. There was an approach which brought in all of these agencies. People were triaged. It was assessed what was the best way forwards for them. Now, again, not every post is going to be a winner. But if the end result, and this is and look, obviously death is inevitable for all of us, but one thing about death is that it's a firm number. Somebody is either alive or they're not. It's not really a discussion point. So when you've got a country with an extraordinarily low rate of overdose deaths, we've got other countries wringing their hands about, oh, isn't it terrible? What are we doing about overdoses? And they either deliberately, willfully, I hope not, but it's possible, ignore what is working in other jurisdictions, then we really do have a problem. And not only that, we can't actually make excuses. Now, if people are going to say, well, hang on, the culture in the Netherlands, maybe other European countries, is different to the Anglosphere. This is not actually a cultural issue. This is a policy issue. This is people who have the capacity to make decisions making other decisions. And the concept of tough on drugs is all very well and good. You fill up your jails, people who otherwise wouldn't be in jail, more likely to come out and commit crimes than before they went in. It doesn't help them for the rest of their lives. Equally, we cannot have people running amok, destroying property, vandalising, stealing. Those people do need to be in jail. But it's the people in the middle, which is probably 85 or 90%, who need some form of help. It's not about just saying, use as much or as many drugs as you want. If people have addictions, that is a problem and that does need to be managed, and it needs to be managed medically. But more than medically, there are these social and other issues that interplay, which means that we don't have as many silos, then we can bring about improvements. So the key thing in all of this is if the Netherlands can do it, it means it can be done. And all the excuses are going to be made by politicians elsewhere, wringing their hands, saying, we can't do this. If one country can do it, it can be done. And it is behoven upon those people in positions of power who can make these decisions to actually learn from what works and apply what works in the local flavour. Obviously, different cities and different towns are different, but apply it with the local flavour. But the underlying principles of this collaborative approach and looking at addressing the total problem and then directing people in whichever directions they need clearly works, and we ignore it at not only our own detriment, but to the detriment of people who might otherwise live. Thanks for listening to Dr. Joe Unplugged. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe, like, and share. You can also follow it on all the socials. There'll be new content uploaded each week.